From the campus of Yale University, this is Business Talk with Jim Campbell, nationally syndicated across the country on the BizTalk Radio Network and coming to you from our flagship stations, Yale Radio WYBC and 1490 AM WGCH Greenwich. All talk and all business, 60 minutes of radio with leading figures from the world of business along with the business of politics and sports. A senior fellow at the Brookings Institute proposing a Trump strategy to end Syria's nightmare, and then a professor from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard claims Trump's education pick is a win for public school parents. Solving Syria and pushing school choice, that's heading into the Trump administration. All today on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. And first up, Michael O'Hanlon is a senior fellow in foreign policy at the Brookings Institution, where he specializes in U.S. defense strategy, the use of military force, and American national security policy. He co-directs the Center on the 21st Century Security and Intelligence at Brookings with retired Marine General John Allen, and he's the author of The $650 Billion Bargain, The Case for the Modest Growth in America's Defense Budget. He's got a recent op-ed piece we're going to discuss in the Wall Street Journal, a Trump strategy to end Syria's nightmare. Welcome, Mike. How are you?
Thank you. Good morning. I'm fine. Happy holidays.
Thank you. That Wall Street Journal op-ed really caught my attention because if anything seems unsolvable, it's Syria. And set the stage for us, because there are so many players at cross purposes in this thing, from Russia to Iran to ISIS. Try and put the puzzle together to start with.
Okay, yeah, great. Well, as you say, it's a complex civil war. It's not just a terrorism problem. And the two are related, but they're somewhat distinct. And I think one way to look at it is that if you try to go for this complete, comprehensive solution that President Obama aspired to, with some reason, of defeating ISIS and also displacing President Assad in favor of a new power-sharing, consensus-based government of many groups and sectarian affiliations. If you try to do all that with very limited military means, you're going to fail. And so that's what we've been doing for 5 years. We've tried to sort of execute this, this complex pool shot, bouncing off several walls and getting everything to happen all together. And in the end, it turns out President Obama realized he couldn't do that unless he devoted a lot more resources. And so he wound up prioritizing the fight against ISIS. The problem with that is, of course, that hasn't really in any way mitigated the civil war. And whether you can tolerate Assad or not, he's now winning with Russian help and Iranian and Hezbollah help. And so we've got a situation where there's an ongoing civil war with the Sunni side being extremely frustrated, bitter, and angry. And meanwhile, ISIS is losing ground, but I'm not convinced that's going to be a stabilizing solution in and of itself, because the al-Qaeda affiliate is still alive and well within the insurgency. And President Assad, in my opinion, has way too much blood on his hands ever to really be a unifying force for the country. So that leads me to propose self-rule of some kind for the major Sunni areas. That's the essence of what I think is needed, because I don't want to send in 100,000 U.S. troops myself, and I don't think that, therefore, the most ambitious proposals will work, and Mr. Trump doesn't have any interest in them either. And so I think what we're going to have to do is recognize that Assad's going to stay in power in at least part of the country for the foreseeable future. And we can tolerate that provided we don't have the Sunnis and the Kurds live under him. So we have to help them carve out some autonomous regions, and there are a number of ideas I have on how to try to make that happen.
Fascinating insights. Let me ask you this. When Putin originally came in, he was going to align with us, but other than that, he wasn't going to go after Assad. Has he ended up successfully blocking our U.S. goals? And how important in losing credibility was the red line statement by Obama?
Yeah, well, on your first question, yes, Putin has been successful. Now, whether we would have been successful in his absence, in the absence of Russian intervention, I don't know. As you're aware, we had more than 4 years of this war before the Russians got in. Mm-hmm. And I think they see our role as being an exercise in futility. And Putin feels very vindicated, because even though he has authorized Russian forces to use pretty barbarian tactics at times and to support a fairly barbarian leader, Assad, in the way the war has gone, at least Putin's been consistent all throughout, that he thought the bigger problem, the greater danger was ISIS, that whether Assad's a nice guy or not, he's at least capable of stabilizing the country, that we should never have encouraged the insurrection against him in the first place, and that our effort to both change the government and defeat ISIS simultaneously was just
doomed to fail.
Too much, yeah. And so on all those points, I feel like Putin's felt vindicated, and you have to give him at least acknowledge that there's been a consistency to his strategy, which we have not had.
The fall of Aleppo means all 5 major cities. Does this imply the civil war is actually over, or, as you said, that ISIS has lost, or we're over assessing that?
Yeah, I'll get to that, but I do want to answer your question about the red line. I think that's a really important question, and I'm a critic of President Obama's Syria policy, but I am not nearly as concerned about this red line issue as some people. For some people, they say that's really what proved to Putin that we were not serious, or that proved to other people around the world the United States' credibility was not what it used to be, and so on and so forth. But that issue was 2.5 years into the war. And already 2.5 years into the war, we had not succeeded in helping displace or overthrow Assad. And frankly, we weren't even sure we wanted to, because by that point, we also saw the strength of the more extreme actors. ISIS had not yet taken over, much of Iraq and part of Syria. And so at that time, we were still hopeful that the insurgency would be, relatively promising. But nonetheless, we had done next to nothing to actually help it achieve its goals on the battlefield. And so I think that's where our credibility suffered, not so much the lack of a response to the chemical weapons issue. In a sense, you could say the chemical weapons red line was just sort of the icing on the cake, or it was the codification of what people already knew, which was that President Obama wasn't going to do much about Syria. And so I don't get as excited about it as some people. I also don't think that it affected our deterrence in other parts of the world. I think, for example, that the Chinese still knew that we were committed to our allies in the Western Pacific. And, North Korea had already been doing some nasty stuff and nuclear tests before the red line issue. And they didn't really, I don't think, change their calculus about Obama because of that. And some people will blame the seizure of Crimea on the red line. But from Vladimir Putin's point of view, and I'm not defending him, but from his point of view, the Crimea thing was a result of the turbulence in Ukraine that he thought the CIA had engineered. We know that he tried to interfere in our election this year. He's convinced that we tried to interfere in a lot of the elections in Russia and also in the periphery. Now, I think he's wrong, but that's how he views the world. So I don't see any of the other problems around the world attributable to the red line issue.
Okay. What about the moral issue of using chemical weapons? You used blood on his own hands. Half the population's been displaced, 500,000 killed. What about that? And has the outmigration destabilized Europe as a byproduct?
Yeah, I think both these things have been horrible, and first of all, the numbers you cite, they're so big, and it's worth putting them in perspective because it's really sort of staggering just how bad the Syrian civil war has become. So let's say 500,000 people killed, plus or minus, we don't know for sure. That is more than half the number who died in the Rwanda genocide in 1994. Yeah. It is probably twice to 3 times the number who died in the Bosnian civil war of the early to mid-1990s before we were able to help stabilize that conflict. So the enormity of the devastation is stunning, but the fatality numbers only begin to tell the story because, as you point out, half the country's population has been displaced. Half, about 12 million people. And out of that 12 million, something in the range of 4 to 5 million are refugees in foreign countries, most of them in Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and Turkey. But a number, as we all know, hundreds of thousands going into Europe, especially in 2014, 2015. And that has led, I think, contributed to not only Europe's terrorism problem, but even to, the political change, including Brexit, perhaps, and other kind of trends towards more right-wing governments. And it may wind up being the downfall of Angela Merkel. We'll have to see in 2017. So, even if you think that this was not a core national security threat to the United States, it certainly had huge implications for our major allies. And so, yeah, I think it's going to go down, I think, as the number one problem or stain on Obama's foreign policy legacy, which I tend to think has been reasonably good in other parts of the world, but certainly not in Syria. On
the moral issue, should a leader like that be taken out just for basically the blood on his hands?
Well, my My conclusion is, yes, he should, but no, we don't have the means. So in 20 seconds, the way I would do it, I would try to promise reconstruction aid to the different parts of Syria that are going to be correctly and well governed. I would not give any reconstruction aid to the part of Syria governed by Assad until he has agreed to a plan to step down.
Interesting. And we're going to get into this in detail, the potential solution for Syria. This is Business Talk with Jim Campbell, the BizTalk Radio Network, over 350 stations around the country. You can go to biztalkradio.com, find the station closest to you, or listen over the Internet, access our podcast. We'll be right back. More on solving Syrian quagmire. We're back. Our guest, Mike O'Hanlon, foreign policy expert from the Brookings Institute. Now, you have this vision of autonomous zones and how this would work and some options within that. Take us through it.
I always preferred, for much of the Syrian war, I preferred the idea of a confederation as the political end state. Because I watched Secretary Kerry, President Obama, try to negotiate this new power-sharing government. And President Assad was somehow going to step down willfully and willingly and maybe go into exile and then leave the country. And this struck me as not just an exercise in futility, but dangerous policy for the United States, because we thought we had a viable strategy. And we didn't. The negotiations bought Assad time. They were actually downright net negative. Anyway, this led me to think that the realistic approach was to let Assad perhaps stay in charge of one part of Syria. And I would still do that today if he were willing. And if he would agree to step down from the presidency, I would be willing and I would support a U.S. policy that gave some limited reconstruction aid to the part of the country that he was still governing, as long as it was not something that required the Sunni Muslims and the Kurds to live under him. And then you would have one sector or two sectors primarily for Alawites and Christians, and then you would have a couple of sectors in different parts of the country for the Sunni Muslims, and then probably two for the Kurds. Now, you wouldn't have to make these uniformly, one sectarian group or another. You would want to protect minority rights. You would hope that someday the country could stitch itself back together into the kind of, cosmopolitan and multi-sectarian population that it used to be. But to stabilize the conflict, I would have envisioned those kinds of multiple regions, each of which is basically governing itself and protecting itself autonomously. However, with Assad now having taken all the big cities, and with Donald Trump no longer interested in being very involved in the Syrian civil war, I think we have to recognize that it's time to modify this strategy. And so I think the more realistic, somewhat less desirable, but more realistic approach is 2 or 3 or 4 autonomous zones in the east, north, and south of the country. And if these could be negotiated, including with Assad and with Russia, then we would imagine an international peacekeeping force to patrol along the borders between these different autonomous zones. It's still one Syria, but there's a peacekeeping force to help, get the new region started, and then we directly provide reconstruction assistance to those regions, and maybe even help them build a couple of new cities, because the Sunni Muslims are going to need places to live now that Assad has taken back all the old cities. So instead of trying to achieve this on the battlefield, I think we now have to use the incentives of reconstruction assistance and try to end the war that way. That's the best I can come up with at this point. I think that Assad might be able to tolerate it, because he could still, call himself president of Syria. He's not going to get a lot of American aid while he does that, of course, but he could still do that for the foreseeable future. And Russia could still claim some vindication that it had defeated ISIS in the major cities. And then we would have the economic aid as the major point of leverage to try to help get Syria back on its feet. Even this is not going to be easy, obviously, and it doesn't achieve the goal of quickly displacing Assad, but I think it's the best we can do.
It's very creative, and I like the leverage to the various, using foreign aid to the various zones so that we hopefully get more cooperation. So now we got to explore the law of unintended consequences, because whatever you do in the Middle East, something else happens. What happens to the role of Iran in this kind of a deal? And is there a threat of Sunni insurgency and ISIS?
Yes. So you put your finger right on the hard parts. I don't think that Iran will ever go along with this deal. You could say that they should, that they're still going to have the Shia groups, protected by this, and Assad's still going to stay in power along the border with Lebanon, where Hezbollah has its main headquarters, and Hezbollah, of course, is a friend of Iran's. And so you could say that Iran should be happy with this outcome, but that we've seen in Iraq and elsewhere that Iran tends to go for more maximal gains, and it tends to want to destabilize the situation rather than create some new negotiated peace. So I don't think we're going to get Iran's help. I do think we might get Russia's cooperation, because this gives Putin most of what he wanted, and it allows him to avoid a prolonged war where Russia is fighting essentially the entire Sunni Muslim population of Syria. That cannot be good for Russia or for Putin over the long term, because they have their own Sunni Muslims. They don't want to be at war with the majority of the world's Islamic population, or be seen as, somehow antagonistic to all Sunni Muslims throughout the Levant. And so I think there's an incentive for Russia, but I don't expect that Iran's going to go along. Also, I think we're going to have to keep fighting to defeat not just ISIS, but the al-Qaeda affiliate, which, as you know, has been called historically the al-Nusra Front inside of Syria. Now they call themselves the Front for Conquest. They're trying to create the illusion that they're not affiliated to al-Qaeda. I guess we could always give them a second chance to prove that, but I think we're going to have to defeat them on the battlefield or help our local partners do that over time. And that kind of conflict, that lower grade conflict, will continue even after this negotiated deal that I'm envisioning. I think you're right. That's going to be a source of difficulty for a long time to come. But most of the opposition in Syria, I believe, would get its major demands met by this autonomous approach, because they would not have to live under Assad any longer. So I think most of the insurgency could be persuaded to put down its arms, maybe join up these new local police forces that would have to be part of the autonomy plan.
Let me ask you this, you talk about a potential long-term solution coming through a constitutional convention in 10 years. This whole template, breaking up into zones, etc., is this a template that could be used in Iraq, even the Palestinian-Israeli situation?
Well, the Israeli and Palestinian situation, as we all know, there have been a lot of contours envisioned already for what a peace deal would look like, and it's like you say, it's a two-state solution. In that case, you're talking about a formal partition of a territory into two separate countries. In this case, I'm assuming that the country would stay within the previous borders, but it would just govern itself internally much differently. And so that's sort of how I would describe it. Now, in Iraq, the problem with this idea for Iraq is that the Sunni autonomous area would not have any resources to speak of, because most of the oil, as you know, is up in the Kurdish area, or even more so in the south, in the area around Basra,
right,
which is Shia-dominated. And so I'm not sure this helps in Iraq, but if they could figure out a plan that would allow the oil revenue to be shared, there's a chance this would work better than the current arrangement. So, whatever Iraqis came up with, as you know, Kurdistan is already autonomous inside of Iraq, and many Kurds want to be independent. I don't really favor the independence agenda, because I think it tends to then have a ripple effect through the region. But I think building on the autonomy, if the Iraqis want to do it, I think there's nothing wrong with it.
All right, just a couple of seconds on this. Do you think there's any chance that Trump will listen to this kind of a strategy?
Yeah, because I think that just beating ISIS is not an inadequate strategy, because it doesn't, first of all, defeat al-Qaeda, the al-Nusra or Front for Conquest group, and also it doesn't stabilize the civil war or allow the refugees to go home. So you need more than just the fight against ISIS. And I don't think Mr. Trump is wrong. I think that prioritizing that fight may, in fact, be the right first thought, but I think you have to complement it with a broader strategy.
This is basically the first sort of solution I've ever seen towards this problem. It's very interesting. I want to thank Mike O'Hanlon. It's called The Trump Strategy to End Syria's Nightmare. If you want to see it, it was in the December 15th issue op-ed page of the Wall Street Journal. You've been listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Next we'll talk with a Harvard professor on do we need an education revolution. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Jim. Happy holidays.
Will Donald Trump's choice for Secretary of Education help bring choice to parents that have long known the public school system is failing our students? Paul Peterson is professor of government at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, where he directs the program on education policy and governance. He's senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University as well. He's written a recent op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal, Trump's Education Pick, a Win for Public School Parents. I want to welcome Paul. We're happy to have him with us. And they've done a survey on parents on school systems and basically netting it out higher satisfaction at private and charter schools, plus hundreds of thousands of parents on wait lists, suggests that perhaps thinking outside of the public school box is called for, and the district-run public schools aren't educating students well. And I want to make a point first, which is that income inequality is being claimed to be a bigger and bigger problem in this country, often by liberals and progressives, and such as Mayor de Blasio in New York City. And yet the first thing that would improve that would be quality education, and the first thing that some of these same folks do is block any kinds of school innovation, school choice, charters, because of the power of the teachers' union.
A lot of families out there without more than one parent who's trying to raise a family and work at the same time, and they just don't have the income to do it. That's a huge factor. And that's actually affecting our educational system, too, because a lot of kids aren't coming to school with the kind of support from the home that they need. So the challenges for the schools are really great. And then at the same time, you have an educational system that is just so stagnant, that it's so ossified, it's so bureaucratized, and it's really in a very self-protective mode, and it does not want to connect out to the community, it doesn't want to connect out to the family. It sort of isolates and protects itself from the family. And I think that's why we find that parents, and that's what we find in our survey, is that parents, if they are sending their kids to charter schools or private schools, they're much more satisfied with what's going on in the school than if they send their child to a school run by the government.
What's the methodology? Where'd you get it? And what are the key points in it?
Well, we actually have two surveys. It's sort of interesting. The first survey is the one that we do ourselves every year. We've done it now for 10 years. We ask a random sample or representative sample of the U.S. public a bunch of questions about education policy. And this year we decided to make sure we got a lot of parents, and therefore we were able to compare the opinions about their schools of parents who were sending their kids to private school, to charter school, and to public school. So that's the first survey. And then while we were doing our analysis, we came across the fact that the United States government also had their own survey that they had done in 2012 and also asked parents questions that were very similar to our own. And so we said, well, why don't we know about this? And we found out that the government had not analyzed the information on charter parents. And so we dug into their data, and we found out that the United States government had found out the same thing that we found out with our survey. So we really have two surveys that are pretty much showing the same thing.
And basically what you're showing is that folks that go to private schools and charters are much more satisfied than those that are in the public schools, as well as finding higher levels of satisfaction with character, values, and discipline.
Right. We look at a whole range of aspects of the school, whether it's discipline at the school or the safety at the school or the teacher quality or the expectations for students, and we find essentially the same thing no matter what we say, what we ask. And that's what the U.S. government found, exactly the same thing. Now, the private schools are the ones that parents really like. I mean, they are off the charts as compared to even the charter schools. And you might have to understand that that's likely to be the case because parents have to pay money to go to a private school. So if they're not going to be satisfied, they're probably not going to stay there. So the private schools really are the place where parents feel like they're getting what they want out of the school system. But what's sort of interesting is that the charter schools, which, you know, are free schools, are open to the whole public. They have a broad range of students. In fact, they have a very disadvantaged population. They have more minority students. They have more low-income students than our public schools do. Well, they are more popular. They are doing more to satisfy parents than are the schools that have been around for hundreds of years.
Is the basis that the teachers' union has too much power?
Well, a lot of people think that, and I really, I can't argue against that proposition. I think it goes deeper than that. I think we have a very bureaucratized system. There's so much regulation coming down from all kinds of places that it's very difficult for people on the ground to respond to the needs of the moment. But certainly the unions add a lot to that. I mean, this collective bargaining that takes place protects the worst teachers. You can't fire them. You can't remove them. And the schools can't reward the best teachers. So a teacher can't get rewarded for doing outstanding work, and a bad teacher can just hang on. So, I mean, that's demoralizing for the whole school system.
Do you find is it hypocritical then that folks that are saying income inequality is a fundamental issue aren't willing to take on the education bureaucracy?
Well, I think what's truly hypocritical is that so many of these people are themselves sending their own children to private schools, or they're moving into communities with lots of money, and they are finding those public schools which have extraordinary resources that they're essentially private schools. I think that's the true hypocrisy.
Interesting. You also, I think in your Wall Street Journal op-ed, quote an OECD, European Economic Commission International Student Assessment in Math, looking at 09 versus 2015 amongst 15-year-olds, and we fell from 26, this is pretty amazing, 26 to 31st out of 35 OECD nations.
Yes, and essentially that means that students at the age of 15 in the United States are learning one grade level less than they were learning 8 years ago. So under the Obama era, the mathematics learning of students in the United States fell by 1 year's worth of learning.
Do you think that some of the explanations, and you mentioned the family, broken family issue or single-parent family issues or uninvolved parents, are those some of the main reasons for why they're liking the charter and magnet schools more than the public, skipping the private for now? Because that's obviously a whether you can afford it or not issue. Dress code, longer days. Well, are there reasons underneath this that make them more attractive?
Well, we know that the waiting lists at many charter schools are very long. There's about 1 million families out there that are trying to get a child into a charter school, and there's not enough of them available. And we know that this sector keeps growing every year. The pressure to expand charters is out there, and it's coming directly from parents. And so why do they want it? Well, they want a safe place. They want a place that's really committed to the children. These are very energetic new institutions. They don't have the heavy weight of the past. And they don't have as much resources as the district schools have, but they can mobilize those resources and use them more effectively. They tend to be smaller schools. That's another reason parents like them. They're not these big, bureaucratized institutions.
What has been the success and the focus of Race to the Top, which has been the Obama strategy, right?
Well, Race to the Top was two things. It was Common Core standards. Let's make sure that everybody sets very high standards of a certain kind, and never mind how they're going to be implemented. And, they've been stumbling around trying to get them implemented, and they never have, really. And it's caused so much controversy, and the teachers themselves are so unhappy about it and so much confusion. I think that's one of the reasons why we've seen student performance falling. And the second thing is it was supposed to become a basis for evaluation of teachers, which I believe in, but which the unions fought back against and totally stonewalled the Obama administration. I think that's a secret story that's not really well known, that the unions got the best of the Obama administration.
And you're saying that an irony is that the implementation of Common Core, i.e. higher standards, has resulted in lower education performance?
Well, Common Core comes on in 2009, and that's the year when math performance was not very good then, but it's gotten a lot worse since. So how do it looks to me like it introduced a lot of confusion into the educational system.
You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell, coming to you from our flagship stations, JL Radio, WGCY, and WYBC. That's Greenwich Radio. 350 stations around the country on the Biz Talk Radio Network. Go to the station nearest to you. which you can find on the internet at biztalkradio.com. And you can also access our podcast. We'll look into some more reasons why choice may be the way to go in our next segment. We're back for our final national segment from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. Paul Peterson has written the op-ed on school choice. Do you know anything about Betsy DeVos? And of course, the title of your article suggests that it's a win.
Well, Betsy DeVos has had a lot of experience at trying to open up opportunities for children, disadvantaged children in particular, giving them the chance to go to a private school instead of a public school, or helping charter schools get started in the state of Michigan and around the country. So there is nobody out there that's more committed, as really put her heart and soul into this idea that if families could choose the schools would pay more attention to the families, and the learning among children would be enhanced thereby.
All right, so let me ask you some of the issues that are raised sometimes by the unions or whatever, that first off, they're siphoning funds off from the public school when the public charters are set up.
Yes, you hear this again and again, and the basic fact is when the state gives money to a school district, they give their money out on the basis of the number of kids that are there. So if a school district has more kids in any given year because the birth rate increases, they get more money. If they are a school district where kids go to another school district and they leave for some reason or another and they lose enrollment, they're going to get less from the state. It has nothing to do with charters. It has to do with a state aid formula. And the state aid formula makes absolute sense. Why would you give money to a school district if they didn't have any students? When the charters come along and they recruit students, and those students are no longer going to the school district, the money follows the child. But the school district will still have the same amount of money per pupil as it has always had.
What about the comment that the performance of for-profit charters is supposedly mixed, and there's quality issues there?
Well, I actually looked at that very carefully in the city of Philadelphia some years back when there was a huge controversy over this. And I managed to get the data from the Pennsylvania school system, and I took a really careful look at it, and I had no idea what I was going to find. And what I found was it was the non-profit schools that were not doing well.
Really?
The for-profit schools were the ones who were really outshining the public schools by a large margin.
Interesting.
Now, I don't want to say that means that for-profits are good everywhere and non-profits are never good. Some of the best charter schools in the country are non-profits. There's a lot of the KIPP schools, the Success Academy in New York City, and many other really outstanding charter schools are non-profits. But there are some very good for-profit schools, too. I mean, it really has much more to do with the particular leadership you have than whether or not somebody is going to make a little money on the enterprise.
I've heard that the leadership is the key variable. Now, another criticism is that they cherry-pick students. Really, most of the time, it's a pure lottery. But is there a tendency for folks that get in that waiting line to have parents that are much more committed to education? And you raised the family dysfunction issue before. So is there a little bit better mix that ends up getting into the magnet than the charters?
Well, in the survey that we just did, which is a nationally representative survey, we looked at who goes to charter school, and we find that it's much more likely to be a low-income student than somebody who have higher income, and it's much more likely to be a minority student, whether it's African-American or Hispanic, than it is a white student. It's much more likely to be a family that doesn't own its home than one that does own its home. So if there is any part of our educational system that's more selective, it's the public school system, not the charter school system. And now I will say this about private schools. Private schools do have higher income people, better educated people. So private schools do have that huge advantage, but that doesn't translate to the charter schools.
Interesting. How important, we talked about leadership being a big driver, but how important is not having the same regulations, work rules, or unionized teachers, in fact, in the charters?
Well, that I think is big time. One thing that you can do if you're an administrator of a charter school is you can decide whether to keep the teacher next year or not. You don't have to worry about complying with the union regulation. Also, if you want to have a longer school day, yes, we're going to have a longer school day. If you want to have a longer school year, yes, we're going to have a longer school year. There are some outstanding charter schools that are making incredible demands on their teachers, but the teachers are responding with incredible enthusiasm because the institution has a lot of spirit, a lot of commitment. You do find teachers leaving after a few years, but that's across the board. That's not only in charter schools. I remember my mother left teaching after 3-4 years, and my wife left teaching after 4 or 5 years.
And my wife too.
So that's the nature of the beast. It's a really hard job. I do sympathize with teachers. This is a very demanding job. So I don't sympathize with teacher unions that try to, standardize everything and not let people demonstrate their innate abilities, but try to put everybody make them all into widgets. But teachers themselves we have to admire them.
Let me ask you this. Do you think this is scalable, meaning we talked about that these institutions now are only 6% of the whole population. They tend to be smaller class sizes, et cetera. If we were to try and make this a really significant part of the public education world, do you think it would scale as effectively as it is now?
Well, there's 2 places in the United States where it is at scale. One is New Orleans after Katrina. When they shut down the school system as it was, it's now more than 50% charters, and the school district schools have become charters, and you now have choice between them and across the board, and that's a dynamic system. I mean, that's one of the more rapidly improving educational systems in the country. And if you think about Louisiana and where New Orleans was 10 years ago, yeah. I mean, this is a remarkable story that's coming out of New Orleans. Now, you could say, okay, they had a lot of assets, a lot of foundations came in with a lot of money. So you take a look at Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is one of the lowest performing systems in the country, but it's the most rapidly improving system of any big city school system in the country. The most rapidly improving, and it's because, well, why is it? We don't know for sure, but it is 50% charters.
Wow. Okay, one final question briefly. Are you bullish about the Trump administration and Betsy DeVos coming in with whatever they're going to try and do?
Well, you got to remember that Washington can only do so much with respect to education. Right. Education's a state and local matter, and so it's going to be more cheerleading than it is going to be actually doing things. But it will be good to have a cheerleader for choice, I think.
All right, thanks to Paul Peterson. That surveys from Education Next, Parent Survey on Education, and the Wall Street Journal op-ed is Trump's education pick a win for public school parents. This has been Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Thanks to Bob Wright on the Suzanne Wright Foundation taking on pancreatic cancer, and Paul Peterson on school choice. Thanks to our national audience for listening. We'll see everybody next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. All right, thanks to Mike O'Hanlon. He's agreed to stay with us for a few more minutes on our overtime segment. The first thing I want to ask you is, following where we left off, why wouldn't this whole Confederation approach have been one that appealed to President Obama?
Well, I don't know that President Obama thought about it that much. I think for a long time he really thought that Assad was losing, and that the momentum of the battlefield would go against Assad, and there were reasons to think that for a year or two, and even maybe 3 or 4 years, because as we got into the 3rd and 4th year, the United States started to step up its involvement in defeating or attacking ISIS and trying to help train insurgents. And so it wasn't until the Russian intervention that the whole thing became, so clear that we weren't going to displace Assad. I'm not defending President Obama's thinking. I think he, should have been considering ideas like Confederation a lot sooner. But if we go back and try to understand his thought process, I think he always hoped that this idea of a negotiation to displace Assad might work. And then he thought, even after Russia intervened, that the Russians themselves might help us push Assad out, because the Russians had no particular loyalty to Assad. And they would recognize that if we're going to end the war, we might need a new guy, all of us together. And so I think that was, again, a naive hope. in this case. I don't want to, obviously very smart people on the United States side who were negotiating it, but I think they did not think through clearly enough the power realities in Syria. And that's what I mean when I say naive. I just don't think they were grappling with the reality that Assad did not want to go. He wanted to stay to protect his own people, to hold on to his own job, and he didn't see any need to go. So the whole negotiation that we were doing in Geneva through the UN process, this just never really had a chance. And I was arguing that all along. And unfortunately, President Obama decided that at least it gave him, a Hail Mary strategy, a hope. And that was enough to sort of deal with a problem that he didn't really want to deal with very much. And that's my best effort at interpreting why Obama never was interested in an idea like confederation.
Interesting. A little history question now, because I don't really know it. Iraq, we know, was cobbled together almost by Churchill on a napkin after World War I, and so it's putting together Sunni, Shia, and Kurds. What is the Syrian history? Is a confederation a natural outgrowth from these different things, or would it be a real cultural shift to the country?
Well, it's a good question. I think that first of all, the post-World War I period also helped establish the contours of the Syrian state. And there were about a half dozen major groups that were part of that. And they were distinct, and they were recognized as distinct at the time. And some of them went off and formed Lebanon, which originally had been part of this whole Syrian construct. And we know that Lebanon today has these three major groups, Shia, Sunni, and Christian, that essentially have a power-sharing arrangement of some kind. And it's not formal confederation, but it's sort of quota system for major positions within government. It doesn't work perfectly, but it probably works better than some of the things they've had in Lebanon over the years. And right now, at least, that country is more or less at peace. And so, I do think that there's some history that Syria's own past and own demographic composition could lend itself to this kind of approach. Okay,
Hafez Assad. Son comes in, Bashar al-Assad. I think he was even educated in Europe. Maybe I was naive. I thought that he might be a more moderate force than his father. He's ended up being worse.
Yeah. Well, Secretary Kerry, when he was senator, I think he publicly said that he thought Assad could be a reformer somewhere around 2010, just before the Arab Spring began. And then when the Arab Spring began, Assad sort of faced a fundamental choice. Does he try to deal with this crisis through power sharing, or does he try to defeat it in the strong-armed way that his own father had done? But of course, his own father did it in a much more limited and quickly effective way in Hama, and probably killed 10,000 people, which was bad enough, but it was a lot less than 500,000. And so, in 2011, President Assad made the judgment he's going to try to defeat this war, and he probably thought he could do so quickly, and he was wrong. And then he got overinvested in brutality, and the war took on its own dynamics and became sort of self-perpetuating, and positions hardened. Everybody got more extreme, and there you have it, the basis for a civil war that's now almost 6 years old.
Is he in a position now, though, where he can't afford to compromise or get out because he'll be tried as a war criminal or killed?
I don't think that there's any realistic aspiration that he would leave in favor of a Sunni-dominated government. And, of course, from our point of view, Syria's two-thirds Sunni, and so therefore in a democracy, presumably the Sunnis should have greater say. Well, that's exactly the dangerous kind of thinking that Assad fears the most. And so the idea that even if he could be comfortable in exile someplace, that he's going to leave his own people to a fate in which the Sunni majority is now on the ascent, this is just not realistic. The longer the war has gone, the less likelihood there is of that, because there's so much hatred on all sides that the Alawites and Christians can no longer feel safe in a country dominated by Sunni Muslims unless they somehow retain direct control over the reins of power. What I'm saying is the way to protect them is with autonomous regions and a confederation for their part of the country, too. Mm-hmm. And they would have, their own security forces, and there'd be an international peacekeeping presence, and that would be the alternative. But to try to negotiate Assad out of power, I just think is entirely unrealistic.
General Mattis is going to run the Defense Department, assuming he gets confirmed. Is his vision likely to be in alignment with this kind of a strategy or a Trump strategy that's more collaborative with Russia?
It's a good question. I don't know how General Mattis thinks about this kind of concept. I'm a big fan of General Mattis's. I know him a little bit. I don't think I've talked to him in detail about the Syrian civil war at any point, and I don't know how his thinking might have evolved. So for that one, I'm just not sure. But I think he's probably going to be pragmatic, and he also knows who he works for. So if President-elect Trump is saying one thing, I think Mattis is going to have to find some way to devise a policy within the constraints that Trump has set forth.
Nation building is completely dead?
No, this is a form of nation building, if you like.
That's a good point.
Although if I were a politician, I wouldn't say that word because the word is still a loaded term. And you know, as an academic or a scholar, I can say this because I'm just trying to help people recognize what's involved in this sort of a plan and you know, maybe use provocative language just to focus the conversation. But as a politician, you can't use that term. And so in a way, I think this is the more minimal approach to nation building, if you will.
Rex Tillerson, is it good to be close to Putin? And coming in from the outside, the business world, are you? How do you look at it from where you sit?
Well, I was skeptical, and I'm still a little skeptical, but I've been encouraged by the words of Condi Rice and Bob Gates, both of whom I respect enormously, and both of whom know Tillerson, and apparently were partly involved in recommending him to Donald Trump. And so I guess I'm going to hope for the best. And the relationship Tillerson has with Putin does concern me. I think it's good that Trump and Tillerson want to try to minimize our differences with Putin, but I don't think we should be offering a quick lifting to sanctions before Russia has improved its behavior in Ukraine. So on that one, I'm really hopeful they can be a little more thoughtful and walk that particular aspect of their policy back.
Interesting. Just a couple more quick questions. The U.S. Embassy moving to Jerusalem, is that a big deal or not?
Yes, it would be a big deal. And I was in Jordan in mid-November, and I talked to a lot of people in the senior leadership, and they were all concerned about this because they thought that if the embassy moved first, we would lose a lot of the leverage that we need with the Israelis in order to get a two-state solution that's acceptable to all sides. And so, yeah, I would not, and I think the Jordanians have pretty good judgment. They do not take just sort of a standard anti-Israeli position. They cooperate quite a bit with Israel. But I think they're right about the peace process.
All right, final thing. You've got a book out apparently on the defense budget, and which I haven't read. But to me, their history is cost overruns, and I think it's actually 2 times the cost predicted and 2 times the length to get there. Even Trump seems to be taking this on. Is this something that we should take on? Well,
I think that overall I do favor a modest defense budget buildup, and I got a piece in USA Today, in fact, today about that, about how I think that Trump could have a modest defense buildup without overdoing it. But I think part of that strategy should, in fact, be to look at expensive weapons and see if we can somehow curtail the expense or curtail the number of that type of weapon that we purchase and maybe have more of a high-low mix on things like fighter aircraft. So I think Trump's instincts are actually fairly interesting. A lot of people are criticizing him for, renegotiating contracts by Twitter. And obviously he's not really renegotiating contracts, but I don't mind that he's sending a little bit of a message to defense industry. We have a great defense industry in the United States, and we make the best stuff in the world, but sometimes we do still have this tendency to veer towards a more expensive solution. And, the high technology is good, but sometimes we also got to balance that with frugality. So I'm not against what Trump's been doing on that front.
I actually kind of like it because when Reagan came in and did his big buildup, I thought they just shoveled so much money at him. And Trump is saying sort of a similar thing, and I just hope he doesn't shovel money at him. I guess on the last thing, are there a couple of points from your USA Today op-ed you want to mention?
I'll just mention one in conclusion, which is that I do favor a modest buildup. The force is a little bit too small, but the force is excellent. And I don't just say that out of patriotism. Uh-huh. I say that because there's been this debate about have we really worn down the military. Is Trump called it a disgrace. Today's military, unit by unit, is in quite good shape, but it's tired and it's a little too small. So we need to keep helping it recover, and I think the pace of deployments we're on now is acceptable for that. But we have to be careful not to overdo it, and we also need the military to be a little bit bigger.
Very creative solutions across the board, and it's almost the first optimism I've ever seen that there's something you could do in Syria. Mike, thanks again for your time and that op-ed, Trump's Strategy to End Syria's Nightmare, December 15th op-ed, and I guess in today's USA Today, and you can take a look at what he says on that.
Thank you kindly, Jim.